The boardroom on the 12th floor of Tech Core Dynamics held 23 people, but Michael Anderson could feel every eye land on him the moment he stepped through the mahogany doors. His Navy maintenance uniform marked him as wrong in this space of tailored suits and quarterly projections, a blue-collar intrusion into a world built on Excel formulas and shareholder value. The security guard's hand hovered near his radio, waiting for the signal to escort the janitor back to his proper place among the floor buffers and industrial cleaning supplies. Brandon Whitfield stopped mid-sentence, his presentation about operational inefficiency frozen on the screen behind him. The hedge fund manager's face cycled through confusion, then irritation, then something that looked almost like vindication. He'd been attacking Elizabeth Montgomery for the past 40 minutes, each slide another indictment of her leadership, each number another nail in the coffin of her tenure as CEO. Now a maintenance worker had walked into the room, and Brandon's expression suggested this was exactly the kind of chaos he'd been warning about. Elizabeth sat at the head of the table, her composure a practiced mask that Michael had learned to read over 3 months of late-night cafeteria meetings. Her fingers pressed white against the leather portfolio in front of her, the only tell that she was barely holding together. When security moved toward Michael, she raised one hand, palm out, voice steady despite the tremor he knew she was fighting. "Let him speak." Brandon turned to her, incredulous. "This is a board meeting, not open mic night. He's a janitor. He's an employee with findings relevant to your presentation. I'm invoking open floor protocol." Margaret Sullivan, the company's CFO, leaned forward in her seat. The 54-year-old woman had survived 3 CEOs and 2 recessions by betting on data over politics. She studied Michael with the same analytical precision she applied to balance sheets, then nodded once. "I second the motion. Let's hear what he has to say." Michael walked to the head of the table, his work boots silent on carpet that cost more per square foot than his monthly rent. He carried a bound report, 23 copies printed on his own dime at a FedEx office because he couldn't risk this getting buried in the company print queue. He placed one in front of each board member, the pages landing with soft thuds that seemed louder than they should have been in the suddenly silent room. "My name is Michael Anderson. I've worked maintenance at TechCore for 3 years. For the past 60 days, you've been asking Ms. Montgomery to explain $2.3 million in excess operational costs. I've found where the money's going." Brandon leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. This should be entertaining. Michael opened his own copy of the report, muscle memory from a life he'd left behind guiding him through the presentation he'd rehearsed in his apartment at 2 in the morning while Emma slept. The energy management system this company installed 2 years ago cost $3.2 million. It was supposed to reduce costs by 30%. Instead, costs went up 31%. The system runs on preset schedules designed for 9 to 5 occupancy, but TechCore employees work flexible hours between 7 a.m. and 8 p.m. The AI can't learn actual patterns, so it runs full HVAC in empty buildings and dims lights when people are working. That's $760,000 wasted annually. He flipped to the next section, pointing to highlighted rows in the vendor contract analysis. Maintenance supplies are purchased through 3 different vendors at 40% markup over market rate. Nobody compared pricing because procurement approved the original contracts 6 years ago and kept auto-renewing. That's $520,000 in overpayment. Software subscriptions came next, a dozen overlapping licenses that departments had requested over the years and never canceled when they moved to newer platforms. $340,000 for tools nobody uses. Then equipment replacement cycles that followed manufacturer recommendations instead of actual wear data, creating unnecessary purchases every 18 months instead of every 36. $380,000 in premature replacements. He looked up from the report, meeting each board member's gaze in turn. Total recoverable waste, $2 million annually. Every number is documented in the appendix. Every solution is actionable and can be implemented within 90 days. Brandon's voice carried the edge of someone whose narrative was being threatened. And we're supposed to believe a janitor figured out what our operations team missed? I'm not just a janitor. 3 years ago, I was a mechanical engineering student at University of Washington. I had a 3.7 GPA and a junior year internship lined up at Boeing. Then my wife got breast cancer. She needed treatment, I needed health insurance, and college doesn't come with benefits. So I dropped out, got a job that covered medical, and watched Jennifer fight for 2 years. She died 3 years ago this November, left me with a 7-year-old daughter and $44,000 in debt. The room had gone still. Michael kept his voice level, refusing to let emotion derail the moment he'd been building toward for 3 months. I took this job because it had health insurance and didn't ask questions about why my resume had a gap. For 3 years, I've submitted 47 suggestions through the proper employee portal. Better scheduling for maintenance rounds, vendor pricing analysis, equipment tracking. Every single one was ignored because they came from someone whose title said maintenance technician. My ideas didn't matter because my job made me invisible. He pulled out a single sheet from the back of his report, laying it on the table in front of Elizabeth. But there's one more thing you should know. 3 years ago, my daughter Emma had an asthma attack, severe enough that we ended up in the emergency room at 2 in the morning. They prescribed a rescue inhaler that cost $180 after insurance. I had $67 in my checking account and 3 maxed credit cards. I stood at the pharmacy counter trying to figure out which card had enough room to split the payment, knowing that if I couldn't get that medication, my daughter might die in the next attack. A woman appeared. She didn't ask questions, didn't make me feel small. She just told the pharmacist to charge her card and walked away before I could get her name or thank her properly. I've spent 3 years trying to find that woman so I could pay her back and tell her that Emma hasn't had a hospital visit since. He looked directly at Elizabeth, whose face had drained of color. 2 months ago, when I started working with Ms. Montgomery on this efficiency project, I recognized her. She's the woman from the pharmacy. She saved my daughter's life 3 years ago and didn't even know we'd end up working for the same company. Elizabeth's voice came out barely above a whisper. Michael, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Because Mr. Whitfield is right about one thing. I'm loyal to Elizabeth Montgomery. She saw me when I was desperate and helped without making it feel like charity. And when she asked me to help find operational waste, I said yes, because I owed her. But loyalty doesn't make my numbers wrong. Everything in that report is verified and accurate. You can implement these changes and save $2 million, or you can ignore them because they came from someone who mops floors. Your choice. Margaret Sullivan was already turning pages, her practiced eye scanning the appendices with growing interest. This is thorough, more thorough than the last 3 consultant reports we paid for. She looked at Michael directly. You documented vendor contracts going back 6 years? I have maintenance access to the procurement database. Nobody notices when the janitor pulls files because nobody thinks janitors read contracts. Brandon pushed back from the table, standing. This is absurd. You're going to let some sob story override actual business analysis? Margaret didn't look away from the report. The sob story comes with $2 million in documented waste and actionable solutions. That's better ROI than anything you've presented in the last year, Brandon. The vote came quickly after that. Margaret moved to implement all recommendations and commission an independent audit within 30 days. 14 hands went up in favor. Brandon and 3 allies voted against. The motion carried. Michael gathered his reports, the adrenaline that had carried him through the presentation starting to fade into something that felt like vertigo. Elizabeth caught his eye as he turned toward the door, her expressions a complicated mix of gratitude and something else he couldn't quite name. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement of everything they couldn't say in front of the board, then walked back into the hallway where he belonged. The security guard didn't stop him this time. but the question of how a maintenance worker ended up in a boardroom defending the CEO demanded an answer that required going back 3 months, to a morning that started like every other morning in Michael Anderson's carefully managed survival. The alarm never actually sounded because Michael woke at 4:36, 2 minutes before the scheduled time. His body surrendering sleep the way it had learned to surrender comfort and stability and dreams. His hand found the phone on the nightstand, silencing the alarm that hadn't yet begun, a small victory in a life measured by small victories and smaller losses. The apartment held the particular quiet of spaces too small for their occupants, where every sound echoed against walls that couldn't quite contain the lives pressed into them. Michael lay still for a moment, cataloging the familiar aches. Lower back from pushing the floor buffer for 6 hours yesterday, right shoulder from the repetitive motion of mopping, left knee from the old basketball injury that never quite healed and now protested every time he knelt to scrub baseboards. 34 years old. His body kept a detailed accounting of every shift, every overtime hour, every moment spent making himself useful enough to keep. The bathroom mirror showed a face he sometimes struggled to recognize. Dark circles that had taken up permanent residence beneath his eyes. A small scar above his left eyebrow from the night Emma was born, when he'd collided with a hospital door in his rush to reach Jennifer's delivery room. 3 years since the funeral. 3 years since he'd become both mother and father, both provider and comforter, both the strong one and the broken one, trying desperately to hold the pieces together. He showered in water that never quite got hot enough, the apartment building's ancient system unable to keep up with morning demand. The maintenance uniform waited on the hook behind the door, navy blue with his name embroidered over the left pocket in white thread. Michael Anderson, maintenance technician. The words that defined him in the eyes of everyone who mattered. The kitchen revealed the careful architecture of poverty. 2 lunchboxes on the counter. Emma's featuring a faded cartoon elephant she'd loved when she was 4 and refused to abandon even now at 7. His own, a dented metal container purchased from a thrift store the week after Jennifer died, when he'd realized buying lunch every day meant choosing between food and Emma's asthma medication. The coffee maker sputtered to life, filling the space with a smell that had become synonymous with survival. Michael measured instant coffee into a thermos, added powdered creamer that never quite dissolved, screwed the lid tight. In the refrigerator, carefully portioned meals waited in labeled containers. Monday breakfast, Monday lunch, Monday dinner, Tuesday breakfast, Tuesday lunch. Everything planned, everything calculated, everything designed to stretch $67 across 6 days until his next paycheck cleared. He'd deposited the check Friday. Rent had cleared Saturday, taking $840. Emma's prescription refill took $112. Electricity, water, phone bill. By Monday morning, $67 remained. Wednesday, he'd get paid again, the cycle would reset, and he'd start over with the same calculations and the same impossible math. Emma's door opened with a whisper of hinges that needed oil. She lay curled beneath blankets printed with stars and moons, her dark hair splayed across the pillow in tangles that would take 10 minutes to brush out. Her breathing came easy and labored, the nebulizer on her nightstand silent and unused for 4 nights running. Small victories counted when victories came so rarely. He knelt beside the bed, placing one hand gently on her shoulder. Her eyes opened slowly, focusing on his face with the gradual awareness of a child still half lost in dreams. "Morning, baby girl." Emma stretched, her small body extending in that unself-conscious way children possess, before the world teaches them to fold themselves smaller. "Is it a school day?" "School day." Her face scrunched in theatrical displeasure, but she sat up, reaching for him with both arms. Michael pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. Moments like these formed the architecture of his entire existence. Everything else was just scaffolding built to protect this. "What's for breakfast?" "The usual." She groaned but slid out of bed, padding toward the bathroom in bare feet. Michael returned to the kitchen, placing 2 waffles in the toaster and measuring out her morning medication. The inhaler sat beside her juice glass, a constant reminder of fragility, of how quickly everything could collapse if he made one wrong calculation, or missed one payment, or let his guard down for even a moment. The morning unfolded in its familiar choreography. Emma ate her waffles while Michael braided her hair, her small voice narrating a dream about flying elephants and castles made of clouds. He listened with the full attention that was his greatest gift to her, asking questions, laughing at her descriptions, storing away each detail in the part of his mind reserved for the things that mattered most. At 6:45, they left the apartment, descending 3 flights of stairs because the elevator had been broken for 9 weeks, and the landlord kept promising repairs that never materialized. The October morning air carried the bite of Seattle autumn, damp and gray, the kind of cold that worked its way through fabric and settled in bones. They walked 4 blocks to Emma's before-school program, housed in a community center that smelled of industrial cleaning products and microwave breakfast burritos. Other parents moved through the morning drop-off with varying degrees of consciousness. Michael knew some of their faces, but few of their names. Parenthood had become a solitary occupation for him, the other adults forming natural partnerships and social groups while he remained perpetually outside the circle. Emma hugged him at the entrance, her arms tight around his waist. "Love you, Daddy. Love you more, baby girl. Be good. I'm always good. That's my girl." He watched her disappear through the double doors, her backpack almost as large as her torso, and felt the familiar hollow ache of separation. Then he turned toward the bus stop, joining the flow of early morning workers whose wages didn't cover car insurance and parking fees. The number 45 arrived 12 minutes late, packed with the weary and the struggling, people whose exhaustion showed in their posture and their silence. Michael found a space near the rear exit, gripping the overhead rail as the bus lurched forward. Through the window, Seattle passed in a blur of coffee shops and construction sites, tech campuses and homeless encampments, a city that contained both obscene wealth and desperate poverty, often within the same city block. TechCore Dynamics occupied a 12-story glass and steel structure in the downtown corridor, its architecture designed to project innovation and transparency. Michael swiped his employee badge at the service entrance, descending the stairs to the basement level where maintenance staff began their shifts. The locker room smelled of industrial soap and old sweat, metal lockers lining concrete walls painted an optimistic shade of yellow that had faded to something closer to resignation. Jerome Williams was already suiting up, pulling his uniform shirt over a frame that suggested he'd once been much heavier. He and Michael had started the same week 3 years ago, 2 men grateful for jobs that came with health insurance and asked no questions about gaps in employment history. "You look exhausted." "Thanks. You're pretty tired yourself." Jerome grinned, the expression transforming his weathered face into something younger. "Emma doing okay?" 4 nights without the nebulizer. That's great, man. Really great." Michael stored his lunch in his locker and grabbed his equipment cart. The morning checklist waited on his phone. 3rd floor break rooms, 5th floor conference rooms, executive bathrooms on 12. 6 hours of emptying trash and scrubbing toilets and replacing paper towels, rendering himself invisible while making spaces pristine for people who would never acknowledge his existence. The basement corridor connected to a freight elevator that serviced all 12 floors. Michael pushed his cart inside, pressing the button for 3. The elevator rose with mechanical groaning that suggested it shared his early morning reluctance. The doors opened onto a floor humming with the low energy of people arriving for work, coffee in hand, conversations already turning toward meetings and deadlines and deliverables. He moved through the break room with practiced efficiency, emptying trash bins filled with discarded coffee cups and protein bar wrappers. Crumbs scattered across the counter revealed someone's hurried breakfast. A spill near the coffee maker had already dried into a sticky residue that required scraping with his fingernail. He cleaned it all without judgment or resentment, his mind elsewhere, running through Emma's schedule and calculating when he could afford to replace her shoes. A woman entered the break room, her attention fixed on her phone screen. She walked directly toward Michael, her path collision certain, but he'd learned to anticipate these moments. He stepped aside smoothly, continuing his work as she passed through the space he'd just occupied, completely unaware of the near miss. When she left, she didn't glance back at the break room, now spotless and restocked, didn't register that someone had transformed disorder into function for her convenience. The invisibility didn't offend him anymore. It had become simply another fact of his existence, like the chronic ache in his lower back or the way his hands cracked and bled in winter from constant exposure to cleaning chemicals. He was infrastructure, as essential and unremarked upon as the plumbing and electrical systems that kept the building operational. By mid-morning, Michael had worked his way to the 5th floor, a space dominated by glass-walled conference rooms where junior executives conducted meetings designed to prove their value to senior executives who rarely attended. He was refilling a paper towel dispenser when voices drifted from the nearest conference room, the words carrying clearly through walls built for aesthetics rather than privacy. The maintenance costs are out of control. We're spending 30% more than comparable buildings our size. One voice, male and aggressive, dominated the discussion. Where's the analysis on this? A second voice, younger and uncertain, responded. Facilities says it's normal for a building this age. Normal doesn't mean acceptable. Get me a breakdown by category. I want to see where every dollar is going. Michael finished with the dispenser and moved on, but the conversation lodged in his mind like a splinter. 30%. Higher than comparable buildings. He thought about the floor buffers running on overlapping schedules, lights blazing in empty conference rooms throughout the night, HVAC systems maintaining full climate control on weekends when half the building sat vacant. He thought about inefficiency baked into every system, waste accepted as inevitable by people too busy managing up to notice what was happening at ground level. But he was a janitor. Nobody asked janitors about operational efficiency. Nobody wanted suggestions from someone whose highest credential was 2 years of college completed before life had other plans. So he pushed his cart forward and kept his observations to himself. Just another invisible man moving through spaces designed by people who would never see him. The executive floor remained off limits until afternoon when most occupants attended meetings or lunches that justified expense accounts. Michael waited until 1:30 before taking the freight elevator to 12, where the air itself seemed different, cleaner somehow, as if money bought better oxygen. The executive bathroom gleamed with fixtures that probably cost more than 3 months of his salary. He cleaned it anyway, scrubbing marble countertops and polishing chrome until he could see his reflection in every surface. The work was meditative in its repetition, requiring just enough attention to quiet the constant anxiety that formed the baseline hum of his existence. He was emptying the trash when he heard the bathroom door open. Footsteps clicked across marble, purposeful and certain. Michael froze, suddenly aware of how his presence might be perceived. Executives didn't expect to find maintenance workers in their spaces during business hours. He'd learned to make himself smaller in these moments, to demonstrate through posture and silence that he posed no threat, represented no disruption. But the footsteps passed the stalls and stopped directly behind him. "Excuse me." The voice carried authority softened by something that might have been genuine courtesy. Michael turned slowly, finding himself face to face with a woman whose photograph hung in the lobby beside the company mission statement. Elizabeth Montgomery, CEO, 42 years old according to the business profiles he'd glimpsed in waiting rooms. In person, she looked younger and more tired simultaneously, her expression holding the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned to guard every reaction. "I'm almost finished. Just need another minute. Take your time. I was actually hoping to ask you something. Michael's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Questions from executives usually preceded accusations or complaints, opportunities to prove their attention to detail by identifying flaws in work that others overlooked. The floor buffer on 7. It's been making a grinding noise for the past week. Do you know if someone has scheduled maintenance? The question landed unexpectedly, specific and practical rather than critical or dismissive. Michael relaxed slightly, his professional knowledge overriding his social anxiety. The belt needs replacing, ma'am. I submitted a work order 5 days ago, but procurement hasn't approved the $47 purchase yet. Elizabeth pulled out her phone, typing rapidly. What's the part number? Michael recited it from memory, watching her send the message before returning the phone to her jacket pocket. You'll have it by tomorrow morning. Thank you. She studied him for a moment longer than necessary, her gaze direct but not invasive. You're Michael, right? You started about 3 years ago. The fact that she knew his name created a disorientation he struggled to process. Executives didn't know maintenance staff names. They didn't notice individuals, only categories. Yes, ma'am. Elizabeth's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been amusement or possibly annoyance crossing her features. You don't have to call me ma'am, Elizabeth is fine. She left before he could formulate a response, her heels clicking back across marble and through the door that swung shut with pneumatic precision. Michael stood alone in the pristine bathroom, his reflection multiplied in polished surfaces, trying to understand what had just occurred. The afternoon passed in its usual rhythm. More floors, more conference rooms, more spaces rendered clean and functional for occupants who would arrive tomorrow and expect nothing less than perfection. By 4:45, Michael had completed his basic checklist and started on the additional tasks that separated adequate employees from those who might eventually receive raises that outpaced inflation. He was in the main lobby, kneeling beside a coffee spill near the elevator bank, when his phone buzzed. A text from Emma's after-school program. Reminder, pick up by 5:30 today for staff meeting. Late fees apply after 5:45. Michael checked the time. 4:52. He could finish the spill, clock out, catch the 5:05 bus, and make it with 10 minutes to spare. The math worked if nothing went wrong. It never worked when things went wrong. He mopped quickly, efficiently, muscle memory guiding his hands while his mind calculated bus schedules and traffic patterns. The lobby had started to fill with the afternoon exodus, employees streaming toward the exit in waves, their conversations turning from work to evening plans and weekend preparations. Michael kept his head down, his mop tracing methodical circles across marble that cost more per square foot than his monthly rent. The executive elevator chimed its arrival. From his position on the floor, Michael watched polished shoes emerge, recognizing the specific pattern of Elizabeth Montgomery's heels before his gaze traveled upward. She paused at the elevator threshold, scanning the lobby with practiced assessment, cataloging details others missed. Her eyes found him. The moment stretched longer than physics should have allowed, Michael's hand still on the mop handle, suddenly conscious of the picture he presented. 34 years old, kneeling on expensive marble in a janitor's uniform, invisible to everyone except apparently the woman who owned the building. Elizabeth walked toward him, her trajectory deliberate and unmistakable. People in the lobby began to notice, conversations faltering as executives registered their CEO approaching maintenance staff with obvious purpose. Michael started to stand, but she was already there, close enough that he could see the fine lines around her eyes, evidence of stress and insufficient sleep that no amount of money seemed capable of erasing. Mr. Anderson, do you have a moment? The formality felt strange after their bathroom conversation, but he recognized it as protection, a barrier against whatever this was. Of course. I read your floor buffer work order, the one from 5 days ago. I'm curious why such a simple repair took so long to approve. Michael glanced around the lobby, aware of the attention they were drawing. I don't know, ma'am. Procurement has its own timeline. Elizabeth's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That's unacceptable. You identified a problem, submitted the proper paperwork, and the system failed. She pulled out her phone again, typing rapidly. I'm copying you on an email to facilities. From now on, any work orders you submit get approved within 24 hours. If they don't, you have my direct number to follow up. She showed him her phone screen, a message to the facilities director with her personal number at the bottom. Michael stared at the digits, his brain struggling to process why a CEO would give her direct line to a janitor over a $47 floor buffer part. That's not necessary. It is if we want this building to function properly. You're the one who notices when things break. Your observations matter. She turned and walked toward the exit before he could respond, leaving Michael kneeling beside his mop bucket with every eye in the lobby tracking between them. The whispers began before Elizabeth had fully exited the building, fragments of speculation and judgment that would metastasize into narrative within hours. Did you see that? What was that about? He's the janitor. Maybe it's some kind of maintenance initiative. That seemed personal. Michael stood slowly, gripping the mop handle for stability, his face burning with attention he'd spent 3 years avoiding. Every eye in the lobby was on him now, stripping away the invisibility that had been his primary survival strategy. He gathered his equipment with mechanical precision, muscle memory carrying him through actions his conscious mind had temporarily abandoned. Jerome appeared from somewhere, materializing beside Michael with the timing of someone who'd been watching from a distance. Man, what was that? I don't know. The CEO just gave you her personal number in front of everyone. It was about a work order. Jerome's expression suggested he wasn't buying it. Whatever you say. But you need to get out of here. People are already taking pictures. Michael glanced around the lobby, registering phones held at suspicious angles, people pretending to check messages while their cameras remained active. He wheeled his cart toward the service elevator, Jerome running interference, physically placing himself between Michael and the nearest camera-wielding witness. The basement locker room provided temporary sanctuary. Michael sat on the bench in front of his locker, checking the time. 5:14. Still time to catch the bus if he left now. He changed quickly, pulling on jeans and a jacket that had seen better years, shoving his uniform into his bag. Jerome leaned against the lockers. You okay? Yeah. I just need to get Emma. Be careful, man. I don't know what that was up there, but it's not normal. CEOs don't give janitors their personal numbers over floor buffer parts. I know. The words came out more defensive than Michael intended, but Jerome's concern felt suffocating when he needed to focus on bus schedules and pickup times and not being late because late meant fees he couldn't afford. He grabbed his bag and headed for the exit, Jerome's voice following him down the corridor. Call me if you need anything. The bus arrived at 5:21, 6 minutes late, packed with the evening commute crush. Michael wedged himself near the rear doors, gripping the overhead rail while his mind replayed the lobby scene on an endless loop. Elizabeth's words echoed, "Your observations matter." 3 years of submitting work orders that disappeared into bureaucratic void, and suddenly the CEO herself was personally ensuring he got responses within 24 hours. It made no sense. Executives didn't notice janitors. They didn't learn their names or approve their purchase requests or give them direct phone numbers. There had to be an explanation, some corporate initiative or management training exercise that happened to involve him. The alternative, that Elizabeth Montgomery had singled him out specifically, required believing he was visible in a way he'd spent 3 years learning he wasn't. The bus lurched to a stop 4 blocks from Emma's program. Michael checked his phone. 5:37. Late, but not late enough for fees. He walked quickly, the autumn evening settling into that particular northwest twilight that turned the city gray and indistinct. Emma was waiting inside the entrance, her backpack beside her, talking to one of the program coordinators. She spotted Michael through the glass and waved, her gap-toothed smile momentarily erasing the anxiety that had been building since the lobby encounter. "Sorry I'm late, baby girl. It's okay. Ms. Thompson let me help clean up." The coordinator, a young woman in her 20s with kind eyes and exhausted posture, nodded at Michael. "No problem, Mr. Anderson." Emma's always helpful. They walked home through streets growing darker, Emma chattering about her day, something about a math problem she'd solved faster than anyone else in her class. Michael listened with half his attention, the other half still trapped in the moment when Elizabeth Montgomery had looked at him like he mattered, like his observations about floor buffers and work orders deserved personal intervention from someone whose time was probably billed at thousands of dollars per hour. At home, Michael made dinner from the labeled containers, spaghetti reheated in the microwave, eaten at their small kitchen table while Emma narrated every detail of her day with the earnest conviction that each moment was crucial news. She'd learned a new word in reading group. Trevor had gotten in trouble for throwing crayons. The drinking fountain near her classroom was broken again, the water coming out warm and tasting like metal. Each detail arrived with the weight of important information, and Michael received it all with the solemnity it deserved, because for Emma these things constituted the full scope of existence. There was no boardroom drama or CEO attention or professional visibility in her world. There was only school and home, and Dad and the reliable structure of routine that kept everything safe. After dinner came the evening choreography, homework supervision, bath time, negotiations over bedtime, story selection. Emma chose the book about the elephant who wanted to fly, a story they'd read so many times Michael could recite it from memory. He performed the voices anyway, giving the elephant determined optimism and the birds skeptical concern, watching Emma's eyes grow heavy as the familiar narrative worked its soporific magic. By 8:30 she was asleep, her breathing deep and steady, the nebulizer unused for a fifth consecutive night. Michael sat on the edge of her bed for a long moment, studying her face in the dim glow of her nightlight. 7 years old, and already she'd survived so much. Her mother's death, their financial struggles, the constant uncertainty that permeated their lives like background radiation. She deserved better than what he could provide. She deserved stability and security and a father who wasn't always one emergency away from complete collapse. He returned to the kitchen, his phone waiting on the counter where he'd left it charging. No messages, no missed calls. The apartment settled into its familiar evening quiet, refrigerator hum, distant traffic noise, the occasional creak of old buildings settling into night. Michael made instant coffee and sat at the kitchen table, pulling out the notebook he'd been keeping for the past 6 months. Inside, detailed observations about building systems filled page after page in his careful handwriting. Energy consumption patterns, equipment maintenance schedules, vendor pricing comparisons, the kind of analysis that someone with his background should have been able to present through proper channels, if proper channels recognized that intelligence existed independent of job titles. He'd noticed the energy waste first, working late nights when the building should have been nearly empty, but lights blazed on every floor. Then the HVAC running full blast in conference rooms that hadn't been used in days. The cleaning schedules that overlapped inefficiently, creating labor costs that could be reduced through better coordination. The vendor contracts that nobody had reviewed in years, allowing markup to compound into significant overpayment. 6 months of documentation. 6 months of seeing what everyone else missed because he was the one working when executives went home. The one moving through spaces others never thought to examine. The one whose invisibility granted access to the building's true patterns. He'd submitted 3 separate reports through the employee suggestion portal, each one carefully researched and properly formatted, each one disappearing into whatever void consumed ideas from maintenance workers. The last one had gone in 4 weeks ago, an 8-page analysis of the energy management system showing exactly how the AI's rigid scheduling was costing the company $760,000 annually. Zero response. not even an acknowledgement that someone had read it. Michael closed the notebook and rubbed his eyes. Elizabeth's words echoed again. Your observations matter. Maybe she actually meant it. Maybe she was the kind of leader who listened to employees regardless of their position. Or maybe it was just corporate speak, a nice sentiment that meant nothing when measured against the structural reality of who got heard and who got ignored. His phone buzzed with an incoming email. The sender line read Elizabeth Montgomery, and Michael's stomach tightened before he'd even opened the message. Mr. Anderson, thank you for bringing the floor buffer issue to my attention. I've asked facilities to conduct a full audit of maintenance work order response times. In reviewing the backlog, I noticed you submitted an operational efficiency report 4 weeks ago that never received a response. I'd like to discuss your findings. Are you available to meet tomorrow evening at 9 p.m.? I know it's late, but it's the only time my schedule allows. We could meet in the cafeteria after most people have left. Let me know if this works for you. Elizabeth Montgomery, CEO. Michael read the email 3 times, each pass failing to make it feel more real. The CEO wanted to meet with him about his report, the one that had disappeared into the void 4 weeks ago without a single acknowledgement. He typed a response, deleted it, typed another. Finally settled on something that felt appropriately professional. Ms. Montgomery, 9 p.m. works for me. Thank you for taking the time to review my report. Michael Anderson. He hit send before he could second-guess the decision, then sat staring at his phone as if it might provide explanation for why his life was suddenly deviating from its carefully managed trajectory. The thing was, he'd given up on being noticed. 3 years of invisible competence had taught him that survival meant accepting his place in the hierarchy, doing good work without expecting recognition, finding satisfaction in the knowledge that he was providing for Emma and keeping them afloat. That was enough. It had to be enough because wanting more led to disappointment, and disappointment was a luxury he couldn't afford. But Elizabeth Montgomery had noticed. She'd learned his name, approved his purchase request, given him her direct number, and now wanted to discuss his operational efficiency report. Each action suggested he might not be as invisible as he'd believed, that competence might actually matter, even when it came from someone whose job title started with maintenance. Michael finished his coffee and turned off the kitchen light, moving through the apartment with practiced quiet. In his bedroom, Jennifer's photo sat on the nightstand, taken 5 years ago when Emma was 2, and Jennifer's cancer was still in remission, and they'd believed they had time. Her smile captured the particular joy of someone who knew how fragile happiness was and chose to embrace it anyway. He picked up the frame, tracing the outline of her face with one finger. What would you tell me to do? The question was rhetorical. Jennifer wasn't there to answer, but he knew what she'd say because he'd heard it 100 times when they were together. Trust yourself. Your instincts are good even when you think they're not. And stop apologizing for being smart. Jennifer had always seen him more clearly than he saw himself. She'd believed in him when he was just a college dropout working warehouse jobs and trying to figure out how to be a father. She'd encouraged him to take the maintenance job at TechCore because it had benefits and room for growth, even though it meant accepting a position that felt like surrender after 2 years of engineering school. She would have told him to take the meeting with Elizabeth, to present his findings with confidence instead of apology, to stop hiding his intelligence behind his job title and let someone see what he was actually capable of. Michael set the photo back on the nightstand and pulled out his notebook. If he was meeting Elizabeth tomorrow night, he needed to be prepared. The energy efficiency report was just one piece. He had 6 months of documentation about operational waste, specific enough to be actionable but broad enough to show systemic patterns. This was his chance to be seen, really seen, by someone who might actually have power to implement change. He worked until midnight, organizing his notes into categories, highlighting key findings, preparing answers to the questions he anticipated Elizabeth would ask. The work felt familiar, like the engineering student he'd been before life had demanded different priorities. For a few hours, he wasn't Michael Anderson, the janitor. He was Michael Anderson, the analyst, the problem solver, the person who saw systems and understood how to make them better. When he finally fell asleep, his dreams mixed anxiety and possibility in equal measure. He stood in the cafeteria across from Elizabeth, presenting his findings while his uniform slowly transformed into a suit and the space around them shifted from late-night emptiness to a boardroom filled with attentive faces. Then the scene would fracture, and he'd be back in the pharmacy 3 years ago, watching a stranger pay for Emma's medication, while he stood, frozen and grateful and powerless. The woman would turn around, and it was Elizabeth, her expression mixing compassion and something that looked like recognition, as if she'd been waiting for him to understand something he couldn't quite grasp. He woke at 4:36, 2 minutes before the alarm, his body surrendering sleep the way it always did. But this morning felt different. This morning carried the weight of possibility, fragile and terrifying, the sense that his carefully controlled life might be about to change in ways he couldn't predict or manage. Michael went through his routine, the familiar choreography taking on new significance. Emma woke and ate breakfast and let him braid her hair while she talked about the science fair project she wanted to do about elephant migration. He walked her to the before-school program and caught the bus and arrived at Tech Corps with 15 minutes to spare before his shift started. The locker room held its usual collection of early arrivals. Jerome was already there, lacing his boots, his expression knowing when Michael walked in. So, 9 p.m. meeting with the CEO in the cafeteria. That's not suspicious at all. It's about my efficiency report. Jerome stood, checking his uniform in the metal mirror screwed to the wall. Man, I hope you know what you're doing. Because whatever this is, it's not normal. And not normal can go really good or really bad, but it never stays neutral. I know, the words felt inadequate, but Michael didn't have better ones. He stored his lunch, grabbed his cart, and started his shift the same way he'd started every shift for 3 years. The difference was the weight of anticipation sitting in his chest, the knowledge that tonight at 9 p.m. his invisibility might finally end, for better or worse. The building felt different today, though Michael couldn't articulate exactly how. Same floors, same conference rooms, same executives moving through spaces without acknowledging his presence. But he found himself paying closer attention, noticing details he'd cataloged before but never quite connected. The energy waste wasn't just about poor scheduling. The vendor markup wasn't just about lazy procurement. The software redundancy wasn't just about departments not communicating. It was all symptoms of a deeper problem. Nobody was looking at the systems holistically. Everyone operated in silos, optimizing their small piece without seeing how it connected to the larger whole. And the person best positioned to see those connections was the one moving through every department, every floor, every system. The invisible infrastructure, the maintenance worker. By the time 9 p.m. approached, Michael had worked himself into a state of controlled anxiety. He'd changed out of his uniform in the locker room, wanting to meet Elizabeth as something closer to an equal, even though he knew his jeans and thrift store button-down couldn't compete with whatever executive attire she'd be wearing. He took the elevator to the second-floor cafeteria, his notebook and 3-ring binder heavy in his bag. The cafeteria sat empty and dim, most lights turned off for the night. A few security lights provided enough illumination to navigate. Elizabeth was already there, sitting at a table near the windows overlooking the parking lot. She'd changed out of whatever she'd worn during the day, now in simple jeans and a sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. Without the executive armor, she looked younger, more approachable, less icon and more person. She saw him and stood, her expression uncertain in a way that made her seem vulnerable rather than powerful. Thank you for coming. I know 9 p.m. is late. It's fine. I appreciate you taking time to look at my report. They sat across from each other, the table creating a safe distance. Elizabeth had printed his report, the pages marked with highlighter and handwritten notes in the margins. She opened to the section on energy management, tapping one of her annotations. Walk me through this. You say the AI system is costing us $760,000 annually. Show me how you got to that number. Michael pulled out his documentation, spreading photos and energy logs across the table. The system was installed 2 years ago, designed to reduce costs by 30%, but it runs on fixed schedules that don't match actual occupancy patterns. He pointed to a photo showing conference room lights blazing at 2 a.m. Your employees work flexible hours. Some people start at 7, some don't leave until 8 p.m. The AI was programmed assuming standard 9 to 5, so it runs full HVAC when the building is 20% occupied and dims lights when people are actually working. Elizabeth leaned forward, studying the evidence. How did you figure out the occupancy patterns? I work early and late. I see who's here and when. I started tracking it 6 months ago. She flipped through his notebook, each page revealing meticulous documentation of which floors had lights on, which conference rooms were in use, which systems were running unnecessarily. This is extraordinary. It's just observation. No. This is systems thinking. This is seeing patterns that people staring at spreadsheets for years have missed. She set down the notebook carefully, as if handling something fragile. Michael, how long have you been documenting this? 6 months for the comprehensive analysis. But I've been noticing inefficiencies since I started 3 years ago. And you've submitted reports before. 3 times through the employee portal. Never got responses. Elizabeth's jaw tightened. That's unacceptable. She met his eyes directly. I want to be honest with you. I'm under pressure. We have an investor, Brandon Whitfield, who's been pushing for cost cuts. He claims our operational expenses are 30% higher than competitors. The board gave me 60 days to show improvement or face a no-confidence vote. I've been looking at consultant reports and budget analyses, and none of them have given me actionable solutions. Then your report lands on my desk, and it's more thorough than anything I've paid consultants $100,000 to produce. Michael absorbed this, trying to understand what she was really asking. You want me to find the rest of the waste? I want you to help me save this company. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But I need to know. Why would you help me? You're a maintenance worker. This isn't your responsibility. The question hung between them, demanding honesty he wasn't sure he could give without revealing too much. Michael looked out the window at the dark parking lot, gathering courage. 3 reasons. 1. Good work should be recognized. I've been watching talented people get ignored because they don't have the right titles. That's not just wrong, it's wasteful. 2. This company gave me health insurance when I desperately needed it. That matters. And 3. He turned back to her, meeting her eyes. 3. You approved a $47 floor buffer part in 60 seconds. That told me you actually care about making this place work, not just about looking good for investors. Elizabeth smiled, small but genuine. Fair reasons. So what do you need from me? 2 weeks and access to financial records. Procurement contracts, software licenses, equipment replacement schedules, vendor invoices. And I need you to trust that a janitor might understand operational efficiency better than your consultant team. I already trust that. Otherwise, we wouldn't be sitting here. They worked until almost midnight, Elizabeth asking questions while Michael walked her through his findings and methodology. She was sharp, grasping implications quickly, pushing him to explain not just what was wrong, but how to fix it. The conversation flowed with surprising ease. 2 people who understood systems finding unexpected common ground. When they finally gathered their materials, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of being intellectually challenged, of having his ideas taken seriously, of being seen for his mind rather than his job title. Thank you for this, for trusting me with your analysis. Elizabeth walked with him toward the elevators. Thank you for caring enough to document it. Most people wouldn't have bothered. In the elevator, descending toward the basement level where Michael needed to retrieve his things from his locker, the space felt smaller than it should, charged with something neither of them acknowledged. When the doors opened, Elizabeth held them for a moment before he stepped out. "Same time tomorrow night? I'd like to go through the rest of your documentation." "I'll be here, Michael." Her voice stopped him before he could walk away. "Your observations matter. I mean that. You're not invisible to me." The words settled over him like weight and relief simultaneously. He nodded, not trusting his voice, then walked toward the locker room while Elizabeth ascended back to whatever executive level she needed to reach. Jerome would have questions. The company would have opinions. There would be consequences to being noticed by the CEO, some of them potentially career-ending, if anyone decided his visibility was inappropriate or suspicious or threatening to the hierarchy that kept everyone in their proper place. But tonight, walking through the basement corridor of Tech Core Dynamics, Michael Anderson allowed himself to believe that maybe, possibly, his invisibility was finally ending. That 3 years of competence might actually be recognized. That the intelligence he'd been hiding behind his maintenance uniform might have value in a world that had spent so long teaching him otherwise. Tomorrow night he'd show Elizabeth the rest of his findings. The vendor markup, the software redundancy, the equipment cycles. Everything he'd been seeing for 6 months while everyone else looked past him. And maybe, if he was brave enough and she was sincere enough and the universe was kind enough, something might actually change. He thought about Emma, asleep at home, and Jennifer's photo on his nightstand, and the careful life he'd built from the wreckage of loss and poverty. Thought about the risk of hoping for more, the danger of visibility, the possibility that being seen might mean being vulnerable in ways he'd learned to avoid. But Jennifer's voice echoed in memory, the advice she'd given him countless times. Trust yourself. Your instincts are good. And stop apologizing for being smart. So, Michael drove home on the late bus, his notebook full of documentation resting in his bag, and allowed himself the dangerous luxury of hope. The second cafeteria meeting began with Elizabeth spreading financial documents across the table like a general planning strategy, each spreadsheet another front in the war against operational waste. Michael arrived carrying his 3-ring binder organized by category, tabs color-coded in a system that made sense only to him, but revealed patterns invisible to people who never looked at buildings as living organisms consuming resources. She pointed to a highlighted section in his energy analysis. "You mentioned the AI can't learn actual patterns. What would it take to reprogram it?" Michael pulled out his laptop, a 6-year-old Dell held together with electrical tape and determination. "The system has occupancy sensors, but they're not connected to the learning algorithm. Someone made that decision during installation, probably to simplify the initial setup. We'd need to integrate the sensor data, then train the AI on 3 months of actual usage before switching to adaptive mode. The building controls contractor would charge maybe $40,000 for the work. ROI hits in 6 weeks. Elizabeth made notes in the margin of his report, her handwriting precise and efficient. "What about the other systems? You mentioned HVAC running full capacity on weekends. Conference rooms maintain 72 degrees even when they're empty for days. Nobody programmed weekend schedules because the original assumption was this building would be 9 to 5. But your employees are here Saturdays, Sundays, working weird hours because tech doesn't follow banker schedules. The disconnect costs about $200,000 annually just in wasted climate control." They worked through the energy section methodically, Elizabeth asking questions that forced Michael to defend his calculations and methodology. She wasn't accepting his analysis on faith. She was stress testing it the way she'd probably learned to stress test business projections and investment proposals. The scrutiny felt validating rather than threatening, proof that she took his work seriously enough to challenge it. By 10:30, they'd moved to vendor contracts, Michael laying out his pricing comparisons across 3 suppliers. "Your maintenance supplies come from Allied Building Services at 40% markup over market rate. Nobody's reviewed this contract in 6 years because procurement just auto-renews based on the original approval. Elizabeth flipped through the invoices Michael had photographed. How did you get access to these? They're in the recycling bins outside procurement every Friday afternoon. I collect trash, remember? One woman's spreadsheet printout is another man's evidence of systemic waste. Something shifted in Elizabeth's expression, recognition mixed with what might have been shame. We've been literally throwing away the information we needed while paying you to notice it, and then ignoring you when you tried to tell us. The observation landed with uncomfortable accuracy. Michael didn't respond, letting the silence carry the weight of 3 years' worth of dismissed work orders and ignored suggestions. Elizabeth set down the invoices carefully, meeting his eyes with deliberate intention. I'm sorry. For every time someone treated you as invisible, for every report that disappeared into the void, for building a system where the person with the best information was the least likely to be heard. Michael hadn't expected apology, especially not one that acknowledged systemic failure rather than individual oversight. Apologies don't fix the problem. Better processes fix the problem. You're right, so let's fix it. She pulled out a legal pad, starting a new page. What would a better process look like? They spent the next hour designing a system where maintenance observations fed directly into operational reviews, where work orders triggered automatic analysis of patterns, where the people closest to actual building function had structured channels to report inefficiency. Elizabeth took notes with the focus of someone building a blueprint, occasionally stopping Michael to clarify implementation details or flag potential bureaucratic resistance. The conversation evolved beyond pure efficiency analysis into something more philosophical: how organizations went blind to their own waste, how hierarchy created information asymmetries that hurt everyone, how visibility and invisibility weren't just social constructs but structural features of corporate architecture. You see things because people don't see you. Elizabeth's tone carried curiosity rather than pity. That's both advantage and tragedy. Michael considered the observation, weighing honesty against self-protection. Being invisible means watching people behave like you're not there. You learn things about human nature, about who throws trash 3 feet from garbage cans because they know someone will pick it up, about who says thank you to empty rooms, about which executives learn your name, and which ones will never register you as a person. Which am I? You learned my name the first day I started. I know because Jerome told me. You were the only executive who did. Elizabeth absorbed this quietly, something vulnerable crossing her features before she controlled it. My father started this company with 3 employees in a converted garage. He knew everyone's name, everyone's birthday, everyone's kids. When he died and I took over, people expected me to be him. But I wasn't good at the personal stuff. I was good at systems and strategy and numbers. So I focused there and told myself it was enough. She traced the edge of her coffee cup with one finger, the gesture unconscious. But after he died, I'd go to the pharmacy at odd hours because I couldn't sleep. One night I saw this man at the counter, trying to pay for his daughter's medication with cards that kept getting declined. The pharmacist was getting impatient, people in line were staring, and this man just kept his dignity, even though you could see he was breaking inside. Michael's chest tightened, recognition sliding into place with the weight of revelation. That was you. At the pharmacy. Elizabeth nodded, her eyes meeting his directly. I paid for the inhaler because I couldn't stand watching someone suffer when I had the power to help. You thanked me, and I left before it could become a thing. But I thought about you after, about how someone could be that devoted to their child, that determined to do right even when everything was stacked against them. I thought about how my father would have helped, and how I'd almost walked past because I was too buried in my own problems to notice. 2 weeks later, you started working here. I saw your name on the new hire list and recognized it from the pharmacy receipt. I wanted to tell you, but what would I say? Hi, remember when I paid for your daughter's medication because you were desperate? Let's make it awkward. So instead, you just watched me for 3 years. I tried to help without making you feel like charity. The Christmas gifts for maintenance staff, the expedited approvals when I could justify them, small things that wouldn't make you feel indebted or expose the connection. Michael struggled with competing emotions, gratitude for the help, frustration at the secrecy, something deeper that felt dangerously close to connection. Why tell me now? Because working with you these past 2 nights, I realized I don't want to keep helping from a distance. You're not some charity case I'm managing. You're the smartest operational analyst I've encountered in 12 years of running this company. And I'm tired of pretending we don't have history, just because acknowledging it might be complicated. The vulnerability in her admission felt like a gift Michael wasn't sure he deserved or knew how to accept. 3 years I've been trying to find you, to say thank you, to pay you back. You don't owe me anything. But if you want to pay me back, help me save this company. Show me where the rest of the waste is hiding. They returned to the analysis, but something fundamental had shifted. The conversation carried new weight, each insight Michael shared feeling less like employee suggestion and more like partnership between people who saw each other clearly despite every structural barrier designed to keep them separate. By midnight, Michael had walked Elizabeth through vendor contracts, software licenses, and equipment replacement cycles. The total recoverable waste came to $2 million. Close enough to Brandon Whitfield's $2.3 million accusation that implementing Michael's solutions would effectively eliminate the investor's primary criticism. Elizabeth sat back, processing the implications. If we can implement all this, if the numbers hold up under audit, Brandon loses his ammunition. The board would have to support me because the alternative is admitting they nearly fired someone for problems she actually solved. There's still risk. If any of my calculations are wrong, if implementation costs more than projected, if the savings take longer to materialize than I'm estimating, then I take the blame, not you. You're presenting findings. I'm making decisions. That's how this works. That's not fair. Elizabeth smiled, tired but genuine. Fair would be you having a job that matches your capabilities. Fair would be your reports getting read the first time instead of the 15th. Fair would be a lot of things that aren't happening. So let's focus on what we can actually do. Michael gathered his documents, the cafeteria around them quiet except for the hum of refrigerators and distant HVAC. Tomorrow night? Tomorrow night. And Michael, thank you for trusting me with this. For believing I might actually listen. Walking to his car in the parking garage, Michael felt the dangerous warmth of being seen spreading through his chest like heat after cold. Elizabeth Montgomery had been the pharmacy woman, had been watching him for 3 years, had been trying to help without making him feel small. The revelation complicated everything, adding personal dimension to what should have been purely professional collaboration. His phone buzzed. Text from Elizabeth. Drive safe. See you tomorrow. Michael responded. Same. Thanks for tonight. The drive home through empty Seattle streets gave him time to process. Every previous interaction with Elizabeth now carried new meaning. The floor buffer conversation hadn't been chance encounter, but deliberate attempt to connect. Her knowledge of his name wasn't corporate diligence, but personal recognition. The expedited approvals and direct phone number weren't management initiatives, but specific efforts to help him specifically. She'd been falling for him while he'd been invisible. The thought carried vertigo and possibility in equal measure. At home, Emma slept peacefully, her breathing steady. Michael checked her inhaler supply by habit, 8 doses remaining. The pharmacy where everything had started was 3 blocks away, still open 24 hours, still the place desperate parents went when their children couldn't breathe, and insurance companies calculated that respiratory distress wasn't quite emergency enough to warrant full coverage. He thought about Elizabeth seeing him that night 3 years ago, recognition happening before either of them understood its significance. thought about how different his life might have been if she'd walked past instead of stopping to help. Emma might have survived the next attack, or she might not have, but either way, Michael would have lived with the knowledge that he'd failed his daughter when she needed him most. Elizabeth had prevented that failure. And now, 3 years later, they were sitting in cafeterias analyzing spreadsheets and building something that felt increasingly like partnership. The intersection of professional collaboration and personal history created complexity. Michael wasn't sure he knew how to navigate, but tomorrow night he'd go back to that cafeteria, spread out his documentation on software redundancy and equipment cycles, and continue helping Elizabeth save her company. Because competence deserved recognition, because good work mattered, and because maybe, possibly, being visible to someone who saw him clearly was worth the risk of hoping for more than survival. The next morning arrived with familiar routine, but Michael moved through it carrying the weight of revelation. Emma noticed his distraction over breakfast. "Dad, you're thinking too loud. Sorry, baby girl, just work stuff." Is work stuff good or bad? Maybe good, still figuring it out. At school drop-off, Emma hugged him tighter than usual. "Love you bigger than the sky." The phrase had been Jennifer's, something she'd told Emma during the worst of her illness, a promise that love transcended physical presence. Hearing it in his daughter's voice never failed to crack something open in Michael's chest. "Love you bigger than the sky, baby girl. Have a good day." Tech Core felt different now, though Michael couldn't articulate the change. Same floors, same conference rooms, same executives moving through their days. But he found himself noticing details with new purpose, seeing inefficiency not just as frustration, but as solvable problem with real stakes attached. Jerome cornered him during lunch break in the basement locker room. "So, second late-night meeting with the CEO. Want to tell me what's actually happening?" "She's reviewing my efficiency analysis." "Man, I've worked maintenance for 20 years. Nobody schedules 2 midnight meetings in the cafeteria to discuss efficiency reports." "What's really going on?" Michael hesitated, weighing loyalty against discretion. "She's under pressure from an investor. Needs to show cost reductions in 60 days or face removal. My analysis found 2 million in recoverable waste." Jerome whistled low. 2 million. And she's actually listening? She's actually listening. You realize this could go sideways fast. CEO getting cozy with Janitor, people are already talking. "I heard 2 secretaries gossiping this morning about you having her personal number." "I'm not getting cozy. I'm helping solve operational problems using skills I happen to have." "That's what you tell yourself. But be careful, Michael. Rich people don't make friendships with poor people. They make investments. And when investments stop performing, they get liquidated." The warning carried enough truth to sting. Michael returned to his shift carrying Jerome's skepticism alongside his own cautious optimism, trying to sort what was real from what he wanted to believe was real. The afternoon stretched long, each task requiring mental discipline to stay focused when his mind kept drifting to the evening's planned meeting. At 2:30, his phone rang. Emma's school, caller ID showing Principal Donna Walsh. "Mr. Anderson, we need you to come in. There's been an incident with Emma." The drive to Bright Horizons Elementary took 12 minutes that felt like hours. Michael's mind cycling through worst-case scenarios involving asthma attacks and emergency rooms and the fragility of everything he'd built. He found Emma sitting outside the principal's office, her face blotchy from crying, her posture small in the way children fold themselves when the world gets too big. He knelt in front of her, hands on her shoulders. "Baby girl, what happened? Are you hurt?" Emma shook her head. "I'm not hurt, but Mrs. Patterson says I was disruptive." Principal Walsh materialized from her office, a woman in her early 50s whose professional compassion consistently fell short of actual empathy. "Mr. Anderson, thank you for coming. Please, let's talk in my office." Michael followed, leaving Emma on the bench. The principal's office smelled of air freshener and old coffee, diplomas on the wall testifying to credentials that apparently didn't include understanding 7-year-old logic. Emma has been displaying concerning behaviors. Talking out of turn, correcting the teacher, showing disrespect for classroom authority. What specifically happened today? Mrs. Patterson was explaining a math problem on the board. Emma interrupted to point out an error in the calculation. When Mrs. Patterson said the answer was correct, Emma insisted she was wrong and tried to show the class the mistake. Mrs. Patterson felt undermined and sent Emma to my office. Was Emma right? About the math error? Principal Walsh shifted in her chair, discomfort manifesting as bureaucratic deflection. That's not the issue. The issue is appropriate classroom behavior and respecting authority. It seems like the issue is whether my daughter was correct. Because if she was, then she wasn't being disruptive. She was trying to help students learn accurate information. Mr. Anderson, I understand single parenting is challenging. Children from single-parent households often struggle with boundaries and authority figures. We have counseling resources that might help Emma adjust. Michael's spine straightened, his voice dropping into the controlled register he used when anger threatened coherence. My daughter doesn't need counseling for pointing out math errors. She needs a teacher who can acknowledge mistakes and a principal who doesn't pathologize intelligence as behavioral problem. I'm trying to help. You're trying to make my daughter smaller because she makes you uncomfortable. That's not help, that's damage. He stood, meeting Principal Walsh's eyes directly. I'm taking Emma home for the rest of the day. I'll review the math problem she corrected, and if she was right, I'll be back to discuss why accuracy is being treated as disruptive behavior. In the hallway, Emma waited with her backpack, relief flooding her features when she saw him. Are you mad at me? Never. Come on, let's go home. They drove in silence for several blocks before Michael spoke, measuring his words carefully. Baby girl, tell me what happened in class. Mrs. Patterson was showing us how to multiply two-digit numbers. She wrote 32 times 18 equals 564. But that's wrong. It's 576. I tried to tell her, but she said I was mistaken and to sit down. So I went to the board and showed the work, and she got mad and sent me to the principal. At home, Michael pulled out paper and worked the problem himself. 32 times 18 equaled 576. Emma had been correct. His 7-year-old daughter had caught a mathematical error her teacher had missed, tried to correct it, and been punished for the attempt. You were right, baby girl. Your math was perfect. Then why was Mrs. Patterson mad? The question deserved honesty, even if the answer was complicated. Because sometimes grown-ups make mistakes and feel embarrassed when someone points them out, especially if that someone is younger or smaller or not supposed to know better. Emma processed this with her characteristic seriousness. That's not fair. No, it's not. But fair and real are different things. The real thing is that some people will try to make you smaller when you show how bright you are, and you have to decide whether to let them. What did you decide? I let them. For a long time, I made myself smaller because it seemed easier than fighting. But recently, someone reminded me that my observations matter, that being smart isn't something to apologize for. Was it the lady you have meetings with? Michael startled. How do you know about the meetings? Jerome's wife, Diane, told her daughter, Ashley, and Ashley told me at recess. She said her dad says you're helping the CEO save the company because you're secretly really smart. The speed of gossip networks never ceased to amaze. Yeah, something like that. Is she nice? The CEO lady? Her name is Elizabeth. And yes, she's nice. She listens when people talk instead of just waiting for her turn to speak. Emma curled against his side on the couch, her small body warm and trusting. I wish Mrs. Patterson would listen like that. Me too, baby girl. Me too. The incident crystallized something Michael had been circling around since Elizabeth's revelation. Being invisible meant more than professional dismissal. It meant having intelligence systematically diminished, contributions reflexively discounted, competence treated as anomaly rather than data point. Emma was experiencing the same dynamic at 7 that Michael had been navigating for 3 years, the presumption that people in certain positions couldn't possibly have insights worth hearing. His phone buzzed. Text from Elizabeth. Still on for tonight? Michael hesitated, looking at Emma dozing against his shoulder, the afternoon's confrontation still raw. He typed, "Can we push to tomorrow? Emma had rough day at school and I want to be present." The response came quickly. "Of course. Is she okay?" Math teacher punished her for being right. Principal suggested she needs counseling for boundary issues. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, "That's infuriating. Your daughter sounds brilliant. I hope she never learns to make herself smaller. Working on that lesson myself." Another pause, then, "Tomorrow night. And Michael, thank you for being the kind of father who shows up." Michael stayed home with Emma that evening, helping her with homework and making dinner and reading extra stories before bed. She fell asleep mid-sentence in the elephant book, her breathing deep and steady. Her face relaxed in the particular piece of childhood innocence not yet fully crushed by systems designed to contain it. He thought about Elizabeth's question. Which executives learned names and which ones never would? Thought about the choice between visibility and safety, between fighting to be seen and accepting invisibility's protection. Thought about what it meant to model courage for his daughter when every instinct screamed to avoid risk and maintain the careful stability he'd built from wreckage. The next 2 weeks developed patterns that felt increasingly dangerous in their intimacy. Michael and Elizabeth met 5 more times in the late-night cafeteria, each session revealing new layers of waste and inefficiency while simultaneously building connection that transcended professional collaboration. She learned that he'd dropped out of University of Washington's engineering program with a 3.7 GPA. He learned that she'd taken over Tech Corps at 29 when her father died suddenly, spending the next 12 years proving she deserved a position she'd never asked for. They talked about systems and strategy, but also about Jennifer's final months and Elizabeth's failed engagements, about raising daughters alone and running companies alone, about the particular exhaustion of being responsible for everything and having no one to share the weight. The 4th meeting, Elizabeth brought dinner from an actual restaurant instead of vending machine sandwiches. The gesture felt significant, an acknowledgement that these encounters had evolved beyond business necessity into something neither of them could quite name. Michael found himself looking forward to the meetings with anticipation that went beyond professional validation. Elizabeth's intelligence challenged him in ways he'd forgotten were possible. Her questions forced him to defend and refine his thinking. Her vulnerability in sharing her own struggles made him feel less alone in his. But Jerome's warning echoed during daylight hours when Michael cleaned floors and emptied trash and remembered that no matter how many cafeteria conversations they shared, he was still maintenance worker and she was still CEO. The structural reality of their positions couldn't be dissolved by late-night analysis sessions and shared vulnerabilities. On day 16 of their collaboration, Elizabeth called an emergency meeting. Not the cafeteria at 9 p.m., but her office at 3 in the afternoon. Michael took the freight elevator to 12, acutely conscious of his uniform and the impropriety of maintenance staff entering executive spaces during business hours. Elizabeth's office overlooked downtown Seattle, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city in glass and steel prosperity. She sat behind a desk that probably cost more than Michael's car, her expression tight with controlled stress. Brandon called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow. He's presenting his efficiency audit and calling for no confidence vote. I have less than 24 hours to present counter-proposal. Michael set down his bag, pulling out the complete analysis they'd spent 2 weeks building. This is ready. $2 million in documented waste, implementation timeline, projected ROI. Everything you need. I need you to present it. To the board. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. The request landed like physical impact. Me? They won't listen to maintenance worker. They'll listen if I introduce you correctly. If I explain that you identified problems our consultant teams missed. If I show them that operational excellence doesn't require MBA from Stanford. Michael felt the vertigo of possibility and terror mixing in his chest. If I present this and it fails, I'm the one who gets blamed. You have plausible deniability. Janitor came forward with bad analysis. You gave him benefit of doubt. He embarrassed himself. Elizabeth stood, moving around the desk to face him directly. If you present this and it fails, I take the blame. I hired you. I authorized the analysis. I made the decision to trust your findings. But Michael, this won't fail. Your work is better than anything Brandon has. The numbers are solid and the solutions are actionable. What if they don't care about numbers? What if they just see Janitor pretending to know things outside his lane? Then they're fools and this company deserves whatever happens next. She paused, her voice dropping to something more personal. But I don't think that's what happens. I think you walk into that boardroom and show them what competence looks like when it's not wrapped in corporate credentialing. I think you prove that the person who's been invisible for 3 years sees more clearly than anyone who's been looking from executive height. The faith in her voice felt almost painful to receive. Why do you believe in me this much? Because 3 years ago, I watched you try to split an inhaler payment across 3 maxed credit cards, and you never once lost your dignity. You didn't beg, didn't make excuses, just kept problem solving until you found solution. That's who you are. Someone who faces impossible situations and refuses to surrender. Michael looked out the windows at the city below. All those buildings full of people solving problems and creating value and navigating the complex machinery of modern economy. Somewhere in that landscape were other maintenance workers noticing inefficiency and submitting reports that disappeared into bureaucratic void. Somewhere were other invisible people with competence no one bothered to recognize. Okay, I'll present to the board. Elizabeth exhaled relief. Thank you. We'll prep tonight. I'll print materials, you'll rehearse answers to likely questions. Tomorrow at 2 p.m., you change everything. That night's cafeteria session carried different energy. Elizabeth pushing Michael through mock presentations while anticipating board member questions and objections. She knew each person's background, their pet concerns, their voting patterns. Margaret Sullivan would focus on numbers and ROI. Brandon would attack credibility and methodology. Others would split along predictable lines based on whether they prioritized innovation or tradition. By midnight, Michael had rehearsed enough times that his presentation felt almost natural, though the prospect of actually delivering it to 23 board members still triggered nausea and vertigo. Elizabeth walked him through breathing techniques and confidence strategies, coaching him on body language and vocal projection. You've got this. You're not some janitor pretending to analyze operations. You're an analyst who happens to work maintenance because circumstances demanded it. Own that narrative. What if I freeze? What if I look at all those executives in expensive suits and my mind just blanks? Then you look at me. I'll be at the head of the table. Focus on me and remember, I already know you're brilliant. You're not trying to convince me. You're just showing them what I already see. Michael drove home carrying the weight of tomorrow's presentation, rehearsing answers while stopped at red lights and mentally reviewing financial projections. At home, Emma was already asleep, watched by Jerome's wife, Diane, who volunteered to babysit when Michael explained the meeting. How'd a prep go? Diane's question carried genuine concern, as well as it can. Tomorrow I either prove I belong in that room or confirm everyone's assumption that janitors should stay in their lane. You belong anywhere your competence takes you. Don't let them make you smaller. The advice echoed what he'd told Emma after her school incident, the reminder that being made smaller was choice even when systems designed themselves around that outcome. Michael slept poorly, dreams mixing boardrooms and pharmacies and cafeterias into surreal landscapes where he presented financial analysis while mopping floors and Elizabeth listened from behind glass walls he couldn't penetrate. He woke at 4:36, 2 minutes before the alarm, body refusing rest when stakes felt this high. The morning routine carried additional weight, each action potentially the last time he performed it before everything changed. He dressed Emma and made breakfast and walked her to school, the October morning cold enough to see their breath, but not quite cold enough for winter coats. Love you bigger than the sky, baby girl. Good luck at work, Daddy. Show them how smart you are. The simple faith in her voice steadied something in Michael's chest. Whatever happened in that boardroom, he was modeling courage for his daughter, teaching her that competence deserved recognition even when systems tried to deny it. At TechCore, Michael went through his morning shift on autopilot, cleaning floors and emptying trash while mentally reviewing key statistics. 760,000 in energy waste, 520,000 in vendor markup, 340,000 in software redundancy, 380,000 in equipment cycles, total 2 million recoverable annually. At 1:30, he changed out of his maintenance uniform, pulling on the one good suit he owned, purchased from Goodwill 5 years ago for Jennifer's funeral and worn maybe 6 times since. The fabric had gone slightly shiny at the elbows, the cut outdated by contemporary standards, but it was clean and pressed and the best armor he could muster. Jerome found him in the locker room, adjusting his tie in the metal mirror. "You look like you're going to war." Feels like war. 23 board members, most of them convinced janitors don't know anything worth hearing. Then prove them wrong. You've got the data and you've got the truth. That's more than most consultants walk in with. Michael took the elevator to 12 at 1:55, arriving early enough to see board members filtering into the conference room. They looked exactly as he'd imagined. Expensive suits, confident postures, the comfortable ease of people accustomed to power and deference. Brandon Whitfield stood near the head of the table, animated conversation with allies suggesting strategy sessions and vote counts. Elizabeth intercepted Michael in the hallway outside. "You ready?" "No. But I'm here anyway. That's the same thing." She straightened his tie, the gesture intimate and grounding. "Remember, focus on me if you start to panic. And Michael, thank you for being brave enough to do this." The boardroom presentation scene has already been written at the beginning. This leads into the aftermath. The next 4 weeks unfolded with intensity that felt both exhilarating and exhausting. Independent auditors descended on TechCore, reviewing Michael's documentation against actual contracts and utility bills and procurement records. Elizabeth had Michael temporarily reassigned from maintenance duties to operational support, giving him space to work with auditors while avoiding the awkward optics of Janitor directing multi-million-dollar efficiency overhaul. The auditors treated him with professional courtesy, asking detailed questions about methodology and data collection without reference to his job title or educational background. One of the lead auditors, a woman named Patricia Moore, pulled him aside after reviewing the energy analysis. "This is excellent work. Better than most operational audits we conduct for companies paying us 6 figures. Where'd you learn systems analysis?" "College, mostly, and 3 years of watching building function while everyone else went home. You should consider consulting. Firms would pay well for someone who can identify inefficiency this precisely." The suggestion felt simultaneously validating and impossible. Michael couldn't imagine life where his competence commanded consultant fees instead of maintenance wages, couldn't bridge the gap between his current reality and the alternate timeline Patricia's comment implied. But the audit results came back on day 28. Michael's findings verified at 97% accuracy. 2.1 million in recoverable waste. Implementation costs slightly lower than projected. ROI timeline confirmed. The auditor's final report recommended immediate implementation of all suggestions and noted that TechCore had significantly underutilized internal analytical capabilities. The board meeting where results were presented felt anticlimactic compared to Michael's original presentation. Margaret Sullivan moved to implement all recommendations. The motion passed 16-3 with Brandon and his remaining allies voting against, and Elizabeth's position as CEO was secured through the next fiscal year. Brandon left the boardroom without speaking, his empire of criticism dismantled by Janitor's documentation and independent verification. Michael heard later that Brandon began selling his shares, looking to exit investment that had stopped serving his acquisition agenda. Elizabeth found Michael in the cafeteria that evening, the space that had become their unofficial headquarters over 6 weeks of collaboration. She carried bottle of champagne and 2 plastic cups from the vending machine area. We did it. The audit passed, the board voted for implementation, Brandon's retreating. We actually saved the company. Michael accepted the cup she poured, the champagne ridiculous in its incongruity with their surroundings. You saved the company. I just provided data. Don't diminish what you did. She raised her cup. To operational excellence, wherever we find it. They drank to that, the champagne cheap and celebratory and tasting like possibility. The cafeteria around them held 6 weeks of late-night conversations, 2 people learning to see each other clearly, despite every structural barrier designed to keep them separate. What happens next? Michael's question carried weight beyond professional trajectory. Next, we implement. Turn your analysis into actual practice. Reprogram the AI, renegotiate vendor contracts, consolidate software licenses. Transform documentation into operational reality. And after that? Elizabeth met his eyes, her expression vulnerable in the way he'd learned meant she was about to risk honesty. After that, we figure out what this is. Because these past 6 weeks haven't just been about saving company. They've been about 2 people who see each other clearly when the world keeps trying to make us invisible. I don't know how to do this. My world and yours don't exactly overlap. Maybe they don't have to overlap. Maybe we just need to be brave enough to build something new in the space between. Michael wanted to believe her, wanted to imagine that connection built over cafeteria tables and spreadsheet analysis could transcend the gulf between CEO and maintenance worker. But Jerome's warning echoed and reality intruded, and the structural impossibility of what they were building felt overwhelming in its complexity. I need to think about this, about what it means and whether I'm ready for whatever comes next. Elizabeth nodded, understanding rather than hurt. Take your time. I'm not going anywhere. But as Michael drove home that night, carrying the satisfaction of audit validation and the vertigo of Elizabeth's implicit confession, he knew the thinking time was just delay. He was already falling for her, had been falling since pharmacy revelation and mutual vulnerability and the recognition of someone who saw him completely despite every reason not to. The question wasn't whether to risk connection. The question was whether he had courage to believe that being seen might not destroy him. At home, Emma was already asleep, Diane reading in the living room, having volunteered to watch her again. How'd it go? Audit passed. Company saved. My numbers were right. Diane smiled. Never doubted it. You've always been smarter than people gave you credit for. Now I just have to figure out what to do with that. Start by accepting it as truth instead of accident. You're not lucky. You're competent. And competence deserves recognition regardless of where it originates. Michael paid Diane and checked on Emma, watching his daughter sleep with the particular peace of someone whose world remained simple and safe. Tomorrow he'd return to implementing efficiency recommendations, working alongside Elizabeth to transform analysis into operational reality. Tomorrow he'd continue navigating the dangerous territory between professional collaboration and personal connection. But tonight, he let himself feel the satisfaction of being right, of having competence recognized, of proving that 3 years of invisibility hadn't been acceptance, but accumulation. Storage of observation and analysis that finally found audience willing to listen. He thought about Elizabeth's question about what came next, about building something in space between their worlds. Thought about whether wanting that made him brave or foolish, visionary or delusional. But mostly he thought about Jennifer's advice, echoing across 3 years of widowhood. Trust yourself. Your instincts are good. Stop apologizing for being smart. So Michael allowed himself to hope that maybe Elizabeth was right, that maybe they could build something real in the space between CEO and maintenance worker, between wealth and poverty, between the visible and invisible. Allowed himself to believe that competence might actually matter more than credentials, and connection might transcend structure, and being seen might be gift rather than liability. Tomorrow would bring implementation challenges and continued navigation of relationship. Neither of them could quite name. But tonight, Michael Anderson, maintenance technician turned operational analyst turned maybe something more, let himself rest in the knowledge that he'd claimed space in boardroom designed to exclude him and won. Epilogue. But for Michael, the real victory wasn't promotion or recognition or lawsuit vindication. The real victory was Emma thriving in gifted program, asking Elizabeth for help with science homework and calling her by first name without hesitation. The real victory was waking beside someone who saw him completely, whose love felt like partnership rather than charity. The real victory was learning that visibility didn't destroy him, but freed him to become someone he'd always been but never had permission to claim. On Christmas Eve, 2 years after that first cafeteria meeting, Michael stood in Elizabeth's kitchen making hot chocolate while Emma decorated cookies with focused intensity. Elizabeth came up behind him, her arms wrapping around his waist, her voice carrying contentment that felt like home. "Thank you for being brave enough to let me see you. Thank you for looking when everyone else walked past." They stood together in kitchen warm with holiday baking and family noise, two people who'd built something real from impossible circumstances and structural barriers that said connection couldn't happen. Michael thought about the man he'd been 3 years ago, desperate at pharmacy counter and invisible in corporate hallways, believing competence without credentials meant perpetual dismissal. He thought about Jennifer's advice to trust himself, about Emma's question whether Elizabeth would forget her mom, about Jerome's warning that rich people only made investments. All of it true and none of it complete, reality more complex than any single narrative could capture. What Michael knew for certain, competence transcended credentials when someone bothered to look. Connection built itself from vulnerability shared and courage sustained. Family made itself from whoever showed up and stayed and chose love despite every reason fear suggested otherwise. And sometimes, just sometimes, being seen was exactly the gift it appeared to be.